There is often a lot of confusion concerning the peoples of Canaan that the Israelites encountered when they entered the Promised Land. Today, we are going to give you an ethnographic primer on who controlled Canaan on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Here on Ancient Egypt and the Bible, we understand that getting to know all the power players in Canaan during the Israelite conquest can be a daunting prospect. Conflicting information frequently circulates about the Promised Land from laypersons and experts alike. So today, we are going to do a simple primer on the important people groups of the Promised Land leading up to the Israelite conquest. Now, we're going to start this primer with a synchronic map of the Levant. Now, it's a synchronic map, so all that we have here is a satellite shot and markers for major cities, irrespective of their historical period in time. The city markers are there to give you a sense of where everything is located. We have also included the swamp that was on the coastal plain until the 1940s, when it was drained by the Israelis for agricultural land. We've also included the Dead Sea as it existed during the Bronze Age. Now, probably one of the biggest myths that I encounter is that the Promised Land at the time of the Israelite conquest was controlled by the Egyptians, and that they controlled Canaan with an iron fist and was a mighty empire all across the Levant. And we're going to put up here a map that is circa 1283 to 1270 BC. Now, this is before the Israelite conquest. This map shows us the Egyptian hegemony as it was from 1283 to 1270 BC, highlighted in orange. That's the period of the Battle of Kadesh under Ramses II, essentially his fifth regnal year. This represents the area of control that Egyptian had over the Levant as a hegemonic power. Now, using the term hegemony is a better term than empire, because Egypt never really had an empire. Empires were expensive, and empires are more about cultural influence and control, which, frankly, Egypt had very little interest in. Egypt wanted only one thing out of its vassals: tribute, that is, loot, and lots of it. For Egypt, hegemony was about getting lots of goods into Egypt to offset its crippling 3,000 years of inflation. So, when we talk about the hegemony of Egypt over the Levant, politically, most of the states under Egyptian control exercised a large amount of freedom. That freedom even extended to waging wars of conquest against their neighbors. As long as Egypt got its loot, it didn't much care what happened to those city-states of Canaan. Now, this map shows the theoretical control that Egypt had over Canaan during the campaigns of Ramses II. And Ramses II's final campaign was in his 18th regnal year. However, their absolute control over the region started to diminish over the next 50 years, following Ramses II's final campaign in 1270 BC. By 1225 BC, the actual control Egypt had over Canaan looked more like our next map. By 1225 BC, other powers had greater influence over the Levant than the Egyptians. The Egyptians still controlled the coastal plain and Shephelah in name, but not in practice. Other powers controlled the Levant to a greater extent by this point. Many of these powers overlapped in influence or blended into each other, which is why we're going to show you these one at a time until we give you a final map. We should also point out that in 1225 BC, this is the time just before the Israelites entered the land, or in the first few years of the conquest. So we are now going to progress with the major people groups. And we are going to begin with the one that we would all expect, the Canaanites. The Canaanites here are shown in green. While they were the indigenous and eponymous people of the land of Canaan, their fortunes declined in the late 13th century BC, as you will see shortly. They were the dominant people of Canaan during the early and Middle Bronze I periods. But they started facing reversals during the Middle Bronze II period as other groups started to invade the land, particularly by the Amorites and then later on by the Sea Peoples. By the late 13th century, their power had declined to the point where they had only control of the coast of Lebanon, the Shephelah Valley, and the plain of Arad, and not really all of that. And the situation is even reflected in Scripture. Numbers 13:29, quote, Amalek is living in the land of the Negev, and the Hittites, and the Jebusites and the Amorites are living in the hill country, and the Canaanites are living by the sea and by the side of the Jordan. End quote. Next is Edom. Edom, shown in teal, was a kingdom that arose from the Shasu tribes that inhabited the land south of the Dead Sea in the late 14th and early 13th centuries. The place name is found in the toponym lists of Seti I, circa 1303 to 1288 BC. The national deity is a little-known god called Kus, and the religion appears to be a henotheism or monarchical monotheism. Next is Moab. Moab, shown in mustard yellow, is another kingdom that emerged in the late 13th century. A statue of Ramses II mentions his conquest of Moab. During the 8th century, Moab will expand northwards and east, conquering parts of Ammon and Dibon. At that time, Moab made Dibon its capital city, and the main god of Moab was Chemosh. Next, Ammon. The early 13th century BC had its winners and losers. If Canaanite were among the losers, so too were the Ammonites. The Ammonites may have settled the area of Jordan as early as the 18th century BC, and their kingdom stretched westward to the Jordan and south to include Dibon as late as the 15th century. But their borders retreated first at the hands of the Amorites, and then later in the 8th century because of the Moabites. The main god of the Ammonites was Milcom. The Hurrians. The Hurrians, or Naharayan, shown in light blue, were the remnants of the Mitanni Empire. In the late 14th century, the Hittite emperor Suppiluliuma I annexed much of the northern regions of Mitanni, and sometime between 1268 and 1238 BC, Middle Assyrian Emperor Shalmaneser I conquered the Mitanni Empire. However, the Assyrians didn't maintain their annexation. Mitanni disintegrated into a collection of city-states and migratory groups loosely called the Hurrians. These groups sojourned across the northern Levant. In the 11th century BC, the Hurrians reformed into the kingdoms of Aram. The Hittites. The Hittites, shown in purple, were a group of Indo-Europeans from the region of Anatolia, that's modern Turkey. They expanded their holdings from their capital city Hattusa in the east all the way to the Mediterranean and southward into the northern Levant. They held a large portion of what is today Syria and Lebanon. Their main Mediterranean port city was Ugarit, and their southern frontier included Kadesh on the Orontes, which would occasionally change hands with the Egyptians. The height of their new kingdom empire was in the mid-14th century. However, come the late 13th century, the Hittites were in serious decline. Anatolia had undergone a famine that crippled the empire, the so-called Bronze Age collapse. They had lost their western provinces to Greek invaders and breakaway Anatolian groups, who began to migrate down the coast of the Levant in search of food and greener pastures. They maintained their control over Ugarit until it succumbed to the Sea Peoples in 1190 BC. The Hittite Empire fell in 1180, disintegrating into the Neo-Hittite kingdoms. The Amorites. Okay, this is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. If you don't understand the role of the Amorite kingdom, also called the Amuru, highlighted in red, you don't understand either the Israelite Conquest or the Amarna letters. The Bible mentions the Israelites would not inherit the land until the iniquity of the Amorites was complete. Genesis 15:16. Although many who suffer from the Mandela effect may think it was the sin of the Canaanites, the verse explicitly says it's the iniquity of the Amorites. So then, let's start with who were the Amorites. The Amorites were a Semitic-speaking Bronze Age people originally from the Levant. The earliest records we have for them come from Sumerian texts from circa 2500 BC. And boy, did these people move around. They moved to northern Mesopotamia, then established city-states at Izan, Larsa, Mari, and Ebla, and they even managed to conquer Babylon. They moved down through Canaan and into Egypt during the 11th dynasty, and came to power there in the 14th and 15th dynasties, where they formed the powerful Hyksos kingdom at Avaris. During the 14th century BC, they infiltrated Ammon through the Heshbon and took from the Ammonites large swaths of land, including that of Gilead. It's interesting that they chose this point of entry, because it's the same point of entry that the Israelites chose about 2 centuries later. And Jericho is placed where it was as a military checkpoint to guard the fords of the Jordan against possible incursions. In the mid-14th century, the Amorites conquered the Judean foothills, south to Hebron, and north as far as Byblos. The Amorites hired the Hapiru, not to be confused with the Hebrews, as mercenaries to help them conquer the land. Hatzor was not conquered by the Amorites, but joined their confederacy, maintaining its autonomy under Amorite supervision. And while the Amorite kings were technically vassals of the 18th dynasty Egyptian kings, they paid the Egyptians tribute and pretty much did whatever they wanted. In some places, the Amorites assimilated with the local Canaanite populations, forming their own hybrid ethnic groups, like the Jebusites, which were centered around Jerusalem, the Gibeonites, which centered around Gibeon, and the Perizzites, who lived in the Judean foothills and Ephraim. When Israel conquered the Promised Land, the first 5 years of the conquest is primarily focused on uprooting Amorite domination of the land. In political terms, the Canaanites were not in charge of Canaan in the late 13th century, and neither were the Egyptians. Control primarily rested with the Amorite kingdom. And most of the cities that were placed under the harem, the divine purpose, were Amorite-controlled cities like Jericho, Bethel, Ai, Makkedah, Eglon, Debir, Hatzor. All of these were Amorite cities or Amorite-controlled cities. Next, Sea Peoples. Now, here's where things get complicated. We have turned off the Amorite kingdom and turned the Canaanites back on, just so you remember where they were. You probably noticed that there was considerable overlap between the Canaanites and the Amorites. That is because even though the Amorites were in control, the Canaanites did not lose their ethnic identity. We are now going to add the Sea Peoples in a moment. But before we get into the Sea Peoples, we need to talk about some very frustrating myths I've encountered way too often regarding the Sea Peoples. And if I hear anyone repeat these myths in the comments section, they're going to be derided for not paying attention, okay? Myth number 1. Sea Peoples are the same as the Canaanites. I wish I had $1 for every time I heard this one. No, they're not the same. The Canaanites were the indigenous Semitic peoples of Canaan. The Sea Peoples are Indo-European groups from the Greek archipelago and Turkey. Not the same. Now, some of the Sea Peoples did assimilate with local Canaanites, but that still doesn't make them the same. Myth number 2. Such and such a group cannot be among the Sea Peoples because that group is from Turkey. All Sea Peoples are, by definition, from the Greek archipelago or Turkey. I cannot believe how often I have to repeat this one, and it's gotten ridiculous. Myth number 3. There were no Sea Peoples in Canaan prior to 1175 because the earliest record we have of the Sea Peoples are the invasions recorded by Ramses III. No. Okay, no. We have records of Sea Peoples tribes mentioned in the Amarna letters, circa 1340 BC, and in the Kadesh inscriptions, circa 1283 BC. The idea that there were no Sea Peoples in Canaan prior to the 12th century was debunked long ago. Don't want to hear it. Okay, with those 3 myths out of the way, let's begin with the first wave of Sea Peoples, which are the Phoenicians, shown in yellow. These are groups that migrated from Anatolia down into Lebanon. They assimilated with the native Canaanites and became a unified kingdom as such. They are first mentioned in the annals of Thutmose III as the Phoneku, carpenters, and they supplied wood to the Egyptians. In the early 14th century BC, the Phoenicians had important trade ties with the Egyptians. Now, they adopted the Canaanite alphabet while taking to the seas like other Indo-European groups. They also got into a lot of territorial disputes with the Amorites over Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon. During the mid-14th century, the Phoenicians lost several important cities to the Amorites and the Hittites, but eventually recovered many of them in the late 13th century. We then have a second wave of Sea Peoples that invaded the coastal plain of Canaan in the late 14th, early 13th century. They spread down the coastal plain and eventually moved into the Negev, where they integrated with the peoples of Arad and into the Sinai, where they became nomadic groups similar to the Shasu. Several groups of Sea Peoples are mentioned in a variety of Egyptian records. Ramses II mentions the Sheridan, the Karkasha, and the Luka. Merneptah mentions the Ekwesh, Luka, Shekelesh, Sheridan, and Teresh. And Ramses III mentions the Denyen, the Peliset, the Shekelesh, the Sheridan, the Teresh, the Checker, and the Weshesh. And then finally, from the onomasticon of Onomope, that record mentions the Denyen, the Luka, the Peliset, the Sheridan, and the Checker. Now, a couple of these tribal groups are really significant. The Peliset are the namesake of the Philistines. And the Israelites are going to use the term Philistine as a catch bucket for all the Sea Peoples groups. Next, let's talk about the Luka, because they got around almost as much as the Amorites did. They probably originated in the Anatolian region of Lycia, but they don't stay there. In the 1340s, they attempted to invade Al-Ashia in El Amarna 38, but appear to have been repelled. They established a presence in the coastal plain in the early 13th century and reached Libya by the late 13th century. So the Luca expanded earlier, further, and faster than other tribes of sea people. In the biblical accounts, there's a group called the Amalekites, which etymologically means people of the Luki. Now, normally when I present that view, I get objections. First, quote, they can't be Amalekites because the Luca are from Anatolia. Well, no kidding. Being a sea people is by definition being from Anatolia or the Greek archipelago. See myth number 2. The second objection I get is that the Amalekites are there too early. See myth number 3. And a third objection I get is that the Amalekites are simply Canaanites because they're found in the plain of Arad. Okay, well, sea peoples moved all over the place, including into the Negev. Deal with it. Oh, and see myth number 1. So that covers the Amalekites. So here we arrive at a final map of all the influential groups that were in Canaan at the time the Israelites began their conquest. Now, there are a few minor groups that are mentioned in the Pentateuch that we should deal with. The Hivites. Okay? The Hivites were a Luvian Phoenician migratory group that lived north of Dan near Mount Hermon. See the green circle. But their range is extremely limited. The Girgashites. We don't really know who the Girgashites were. They are possibly one of the allies of the Hittites, that is the Karkisha, but we can't really say for certain. The Rephidim. Okay, now the Rephidim are a tribe of Amorites who lived in Heshbon and were led by Og, king of Sihon. Now, let me state this for the record. I know I've said this before. Og was not a giant. He had a really big bed. Just like Elvis Presley had a really big bed. Do I need to spell this out for you? Then there's the Anakim. The Anakim are also a tribe of Amorites who lived near Hebron. We know from archaeological excavations that they were no bigger than your average American. Okay, maybe not taller than your average American, but they weren't giants. And finally, there were the Nephilim. Now, let me be really explicit about this. There were no Nephilim in Canaan at the time of the Israelite conquest. They were all dead by the time of Joshua. This comes from this report from the bad spies in Numbers 13:33, which they said, oh, we see Nephilim. They made this up to justify their cowardice. We've been over this in other videos, but I just want to repeat it once again here, that there were no Nephilim in Canaan. This was basically bad spies trying to scare the people. So, there you have it. All the major people groups of Canaan at the time of the Israelite conquest. We hope you found that interesting. We hope you learned something from this. Thank you very much for watching, and we will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.